My sister arrived with a moving truck and a lawyer's number saved in her phone. She drove from Phoenix on a Tuesday, and the truck was already half full when she pulled into the driveway. I could see it from the kitchen window before she knocked. She had not called ahead. She had not asked me anything. What she didn't know, and what she had never once stopped to consider, was that this house had not been our father's to give away for 3 years before the morning he died. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that grief sorts people into who they really are. I used to find that comforting. I believed it meant that the worst in a person emerges under pressure and the best is quietly confirmed, that a death in a family was a kind of moral clarifier, stripping away the convenient fictions people maintain about themselves during ordinary times. What I understand now is that grief does something more precise than sorting. It doesn't reorganize people into categories they didn't already occupy. It reveals the decisions they had already made before the body was cold, before the flowers on the mantel had shed a single petal, before the last borrowed folding chair had been returned to whoever lent it. My sister Petra had already decided. I believe she had been deciding slowly and methodically across years of holidays and phone calls and careful, reasonable distance. She was waiting for the right occasion. The occasion finally arrived. And so did she. I am Nora Callum. I'm 43 years old. I work as an environmental compliance officer for the state of Nevada, reviewing permit applications for water use and industrial discharge across the Great Basin. It is not glamorous work. It is methodical, document-heavy, and exacting. The kind of work that requires you to read every page of every submission without letting your eyes slide over the parts that seem routine. Because the parts that seem routine are frequently where the problems live. I know what a filing stamp means and where it belongs in a document and why its presence or absence can determine the entire legal outcome of a regulatory action. I know what a recording date signifies. I know what happens when a document is properly filed with the appropriate county office versus when it is merely signed and kept in a drawer. This is not a coincidence. I come from a family that understood the weight of paper. My father understood it. He kept his important documents in a fireproof box in the hall closet, organized by category, labeled in his careful block letter handwriting, reviewed and updated on a schedule he maintained without anyone prompting him to. He taught me, by example and by repetition and by the simple fact of being himself, that the most important things you have to say should be said in writing, with a date and a signature and a witness who will remember what they saw. I grew up in the house I still live in, a single-story ranch on a quiet street in Reno, Nevada, the kind of house that does not call attention to itself. Wide front porch, a yard that could never quite decide between grass and high desert scrub, and had eventually settled into a comfortable combination of both. My parents bought it in 1978 for $62,000, which was a meaningful stretch for a family living on my father's salary as a licensed surveyor and my mother's salary as a reference librarian. The house became, over the decades, One of those purchases that looks modest in retrospect and was actually the foundation of everything. The neighborhood around it changed. The houses to the north and south were both sold to developers while I was in my 30s. New construction went up on both sides. Larger houses with granite countertops and 3-car garages, and the particular anonymity of things built quickly and without a specific family in mind. The house stayed. My mother died when I was 31, a swift and brutal illness that we had understood too late, which is the ordinary story of such things. She was 64. My father managed his grief the way he managed everything, by continuing to do what needed doing, by maintaining the property, by being present in the rooms. He replaced the roof the following year. He had the driveway resurfaced. He repainted the exterior one October on a rented scaffold, wearing the old canvas jacket he had owned since before I was born. He did not sell the house. The idea of selling the house did not enter the conversation. Gerald Callum died 11 months ago, on a February morning when the light came through the west-facing hospital window in long amber bars across the linoleum floor. He was 78. He had been in decline for 4 years. First, the cardiac episodes, then the slow erosion of mobility, then the gradual drift in the things that make a person feel oriented in the world. I had moved back into the house 4 years before his death, into my childhood bedroom, with its view of the backyard and the old block wall fence. I drove him to every appointment. I managed every prescription renewal, every insurance question, every conversation with the visiting nurse service. I was the one who read the discharge summaries. I was the one who called the specialists when the summaries raised questions no one had answered. I was the one in the waiting room when the cardiologist came out after the procedure. I was the one who got the call at 2 a.m. when the oxygen monitor alarmed, because I was 12 feet down the hallway, because I was the person who was there. I did not do these things because I was keeping a ledger. I want to be clear about that. I did not think during any of those 4 years about what the house would become or what my presence would mean in any legal sense. I was there because it was right to be there, because the situation required it, and I was the person available to meet the requirement. That is all. My sister Petra is 5 years older than I am. She left Reno when she was 22 and built a life in Phoenix around her husband Boyd Lund's contracting business, commercial renovations, light industrial builds. The work of a man who looks at every space and calculates its cost and potential simultaneously. Boyd has an evaluator's eye. He has had it for 30 years, and I do not think he knows how to turn it off. He would arrive at our family gatherings and make quiet comments about the Reno market, this part of the valley appreciating that development coming in, the lot values north of Virginia Street moving in a specific direction, delivered in the tone of a man sharing interesting local information rather than a man taking notes. Petra would listen and nod, and sometimes add a detail. She is not cruel. She is efficient. She converts difficult information into plans. She had always, in her own way, processed the reality of this house as a future matter, not a home exactly, but a future matter. She was simply waiting for the future to arrive. Odette Ferreira moved into the house next door in 1981, the year I was born. She is 66 now, and she has known me since I was 4 years old. And she knew my mother, and she had driven my father to 2 chemotherapy appointments during an earlier health scare when I could not get away from work. She has a memory for dates that I have always found remarkable. She recalls years and months and specific days the way other people recall the general shape of events. She is soft-spoken. She does not embellish. She is the kind of person who, when she tells you something happened, you believe her, because she would not tell you it happened if she were not certain it did. We buried my father on a Saturday in March. The service was at the funeral home chapel. He had never been a churchgoer, and we honored that, and then the cemetery, and then back to the house where a dozen people stood in the living room and kitchen and said the things people say in those rooms. My mother's ceramic mug was on the kitchen counter. She had painted it the year I was born, a small blue flower around the rim in her handwriting, the word flower written out in her looping librarian's script, because she labeled everything in her life, including the things she made with her hands. I had been drinking from it every morning for 11 months, and had not noticed until that afternoon how long I had been doing that without thinking about it. At the reception, Boyd stood near the back door with a man I did not recognize. Not a family friend, not a neighbor, not anyone I could place. They spoke in low voices for several minutes. Boyd gestured once, a broad outward gesture toward the back of the property, encompassing the yard and the fence line and the space beyond. The gesture had a particular quality. Not grief, not reminiscence. Assessment. The gesture of a man indicating something he expects to be in a position to make a decision about in the near future. I filed this observation and said nothing. The first email from Petra arrived 48 hours after the funeral. It was addressed to me and to the estate attorney, whose name she had already obtained. By what means? From whom? I do not know. The subject line read, "Questions Yuri estate process." There were no condolences in the email. There were 4 questions, numbered and formatted, concerning probate timelines, property appraisal procedures, the standard legal mechanism for distributing a deceased parent's real property when both adult children are named heirs, and whether the estate might qualify for simplified administration. 4 questions. No, I miss him. No, how are you holding up? 4 questions in a numbered list with subpoints. I read the email twice. I went for a walk in the cold March air. I returned and did not respond immediately. A week after the funeral, Petra called me. She asked whether Dad had ever talked about what he wanted to do with the house. She phrased it carefully. Talked about, not said, as if she were asking whether there had been a series of conversations she might have missed. There had been none. My father talked about the house the way people talk about their own bodies, as a given, as background, as the condition in which everything else occurred. He talked about the cottonwood tree at the back fence, and the gutters, and the neighbor who had borrowed his pipe wrench in 2003 and never returned it. He did not talk about what would happen to the house after his death, because he had already decided what would happen to the house after his death. 3 years before his death, on a morning in April with a notary public, and Odette Ferreira, and a pen from his desk drawer. Then the letter arrived, addressed to the estate of Gerald Callum, from a real estate attorney in Phoenix. Not a probate attorney, not an estate planner, a real estate attorney. Petra, when I called her about it, said she had been just getting information. She said it with the measured composure of someone who no longer needs the other person's agreement. She had retained a real estate attorney before the probate estate had even been formally submitted. 2 days before Petra and Boyd arrived, Odette called me. She told me she had found out who the man at the reception had been. A real estate agent who worked North Reno residential properties. Odette had a friend who knew him professionally. Boyd had spoken to him at the reception about what the lot alone would bring. Not the house and the lot alone, as though the structure were already gone, and they were valuing the ground beneath it. Odette relayed this with characteristic precision. Those specific words. That specific framing. I told Odette I thought I knew how to handle what was coming. 11 days after the funeral, they came, Petra and Boyd. No prior call, no message. Boyd parked in the driveway, not at the curb, in the driveway, where my father's car had sat until the week after the funeral when I had arranged for it to be sold, and Petra came inside without ringing the bell. She walked straight to the kitchen table and sat down. The kitchen table where my father and I had eaten breakfast together for 4 years, where he had taught me gin rummy when I was 7, where he had done the household accounts every Sunday evening for as long as I could remember. She had a folder, manila, with a yellow sticky note on the front that said, Callum Property Reno, in Boyd's handwriting. Inside the folder, a draft partition action, unsigned and not yet filed, prepared by Boyd's Phoenix attorney, a printout from a real estate listing service showing the property valued at $487,000, with comparable sales highlighted in yellow, and a typed letter from the attorney outlining a 60-day timeline for preparing the property for listing and explaining the legal basis for the partition proceeding. The letter referred to the property as the decedent's real estate asset. She slid the folder across the table toward me and said, Dad would have wanted us to be fair about this. You can't carry this house alone. You never could. Boyd was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He was looking at the ceiling I had repainted myself 3 summers ago, carefully, with proper primer and 2 full coats, after the roof replacement had left some staining near the north-facing corner. He was looking at it with the specific quality of attention a contractor brings to a ceiling he is about to give a number to. Petra was watching me, with an expression that I can only describe as almost generous. The expression of someone who has already won and is managing the transition carefully, who has decided that arriving with a clear plan is its own form of kindness because clarity is preferable to uncertainty, and a plan spares everyone the discomfort of ambiguity. She had calculated the outcome. She had calculated my options, the cost of contesting a partition action, the difficulty of sustaining the property on a state employee's salary, the market logic of a sale. She had calculated that the clean choice was to accept her offer of a negotiated split rather than resist the partition action, which she believed was inevitable. She was doing me a favor, in her own understanding, by presenting the cleaner option. I looked at the folder. I looked at the partition action draft, still unsigned, still a draft, existing as the threat before the action rather than the action itself. I looked at the highlighted comparable sales on the real estate printout. I looked at Boyd in the doorway, his assessment still focused on the ceiling. And I thought about the gesture at the reception, the broad outward sweep toward the back fence, toward the lot, toward the land that had been bought in 1978 for $62,000 and had become, in the current Reno market, the anchor of everything he wanted to calculate. Petra was waiting for me to respond. I thought about the envelope on the upper shelf of the hall closet. I had known it was there for 10 years. I had known exactly what it contained for 6 of them. My father had brought it to this table 6 years before his death, had set it down right here on the same surface where Petra's folder now rested, and said, "I want you to know this exists. I want you to know what it means." He had shown me the deed, the recording stamp, the notary seal, Odette's signature. He had said, "This is already yours. It has been yours since April. Nothing that happens after today changes that." He had put it back in the envelope and back in the closet, and we had dinner, and we had not spoken of it again. For 6 years, I had carried this knowledge quietly, the way you carry something that belongs to a private understanding between 2 people and does not need to be said aloud to anyone else. For 3 years before, he told me, the house had been legally mine. I had lived in it, cared for it, repaired it, and been present in it through 4 years of his decline, and none of that had been in service of any calculation. But the document had been accurate the whole time, accurate and patient and waiting on a shelf in the dark. I looked at Petra across the table. I said, "Excuse me for a moment." I walked to the hall closet. The envelope was where it had always been, upper shelf, slightly left of the fireproof box. My father's block letters on the front. Nora. Just the name. No further instruction necessary. I brought it back to the kitchen and sat down. Petra's expression changed before I had even opened the envelope. Something in the way I carried it, something in the deliberateness. She looked at the envelope, and then at me, and then at the envelope again. Inside, a recorded gift deed. Gerald Callum had executed and notarized it on April 9th, 3 years before his death. In the presence of Odette Ferreira as witness and a licensed Nevada notary public. The deed transferred the property, the house, the full lot, and the appurtenant water rights that had been attached to the parcel since the original 1978 purchase, to Nora Patricia Callum, sole donee, unconditionally and without any right of reversion. Filed with the Washoe County Recorder's Office on the same day. Recording stamp on the face of the document. Document number, date, Nevada Revised Statutes. Section 111.105, a properly recorded gift deed is irrevocable. Title passes immediately upon execution and recording. This property had not been Gerald Callum's since April 9th, 3 years ago. I placed the deed on the table beside Petra's folder. I watched her read it. She read every word. She looked at the notary seal, embossed and clear. She looked at the Washoe County filing stamp. She looked at the date. She did the subtraction 3 years before the death, and I watched her do it. She looked at Odette Ferreira's signature and looked up at me, and then back down, because she recognized that signature from 40 years of holiday cards and kitchen visits, and the particular weight of a neighbor who had been present for everything. She looked at the recording number. She looked at my name. Nora Patricia Callum. Sole. Doni. Boyd, in the doorway, had stopped looking at the ceiling. The room went quiet in a specific way. Not ordinary morning quiet. Something denser. The quiet of a plan that has encountered the one figure it did not include and cannot accommodate. I explained the statute clearly because clarity was what the situation called for. Nevada Revised Statutes, Section 111.105. What it means for a deed to be recorded rather than merely signed. What it means for title to pass on the recording date. What it means for the property to have been outside Gerald Callum's estate at the time of his death, not because of anything that happened after the death, not because of any provision in any will, but because of a document filed with the county recorder's office 3 years earlier, on a day when the Nevada spring light was coming through the kitchen window at exactly this angle. The partition action in Petra's folder was directed at a property in which the estate had no interest to partition. The real estate attorney's letter referred to the decedent's real estate asset. But the property had not been the decedent's real estate asset on the day he died. It had been mine. Petra did not speak for a long moment. Boyd stepped fully into the kitchen for the first time since they'd arrived. He looked at the deed. He is a man who reads documents in a specific way. He looks for the numbers, then the names, then the dates. And I watched him do this now. I watched him find the date and look at it and look at Boyd's yellow sticky note on the folder, and then look away. Petra finally said, "This is real." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." She looked at the folder she had brought, and then at the deed on the table, and I understood, watching her, that she was doing a different kind of calculation now. Not a calculation about the property. A calculation about what it meant that this document existed, that it had been sitting in the hall closet for 3 years, that our father had made this arrangement while she was in Phoenix, attending to a life that did not include the daily work of the house and the doctor's appointments and the 2 a.m. alarms. She was calculating what it said, not about the law, but about him, about what he had understood, about what he had seen. She stood up. She picked up the folder. She said, "I need to call our attorney." I said, "Of course." Boyd did not say anything. He followed Petra out of the kitchen. I heard the front door. I heard the car doors. I heard the truck pull out of the driveway, the truck that was already half full, the truck she had driven from Phoenix for a reason that no longer existed. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The deed was still on the surface in front of me. The ceramic mug was on the counter. The house was quiet in its settled, particular way. I thought about the day my father had shown me the envelope, the kitchen, the evening light, his deliberate calm. "This is already yours," he had said. "Nothing that happens after today changes that." He had been right. Nothing had changed it. The house had been mine through the 4 years of his decline, through every appointment, every alarm, every long night, through his death, through the funeral and the reception, and Boyd's gesture toward the back fence, through the real estate attorney's letter and Petra's folder and the moving truck in the driveway. The house had simply been mine. I had known it the whole time. I'd kept knowing it quietly, without mentioning it, without using it as a weight in any conversation. It had not felt like a weapon. It had felt like a fact. And now the fact was on the table. Petra retained her estate attorney within the week. The attorney sent a formal objection letter 7 days after I produced the deed. The letter argued that the gift deed had been executed during a period of cognitive impairment, that my father's mental capacity 3 years before his death had been compromised by the early-stage cardiac decline that had been documented in his medical records, and that the deed was therefore the product of reduced capacity and potentially undue influence, and should be set aside. I sat with the letter for an afternoon. I thought about my father on April 9th, 3 years before his death. He had been 66 years old that morning. His first cardiac episode had been 18 months earlier, significant, requiring intervention, resulting in lifestyle changes and medication, and the beginning of what became a long decline. But 3 years before his death, he had been alert. He had been driving himself. He had been doing the household accounts on Sunday evenings. He had been the one who called the visiting nurse service when he decided he needed help managing his morning medications, because he made that assessment himself and acted on it himself. 3 years before his death. My father was a man who understood exactly what he was doing. I called my attorney. I told her what I had, and then I gave it to her. The notarized deed itself, the original with the notary seal and the recording stamp and the document number and the date. Odette Ferreira's sworn statement, which she gave with the precision and completeness that I would have expected from her and that I know would have made my father proud. She stated, under penalty of perjury, that she had been present at the signing on April 9th, that my father had arrived at the appointment having already reviewed the draft deed with the property attorney who had prepared it, that he had been alert, specific, and purposeful throughout, that he had explained his intentions to both Odette and the notary without any prompting from either of them, that he had read each page of the deed before signing, that he had asked Odette specifically to witness the signing because he trusted her memory and her integrity and wanted someone present who would be able to speak to his state of mind if anyone ever needed to know it, that she had known him for more than 40 years and had never, in all of that time, seen him more clearly himself than he was on that April morning. The Washoe County Recorder's filing receipt, date stamped and document numbered, reflecting the recording that had taken place on the same day as the signing. And the note. I have thought a great deal over the years since my father showed me the envelope about those 2 sentences. This is for the one who stayed. Don't let Boyd Lund put a number on your kitchen. He had written them on a sheet of his cream-colored personal stationery in the dark blue ink he preferred. In the handwriting I had known since I was a child, learning to read by studying the labels on things he stored in the hall closet. He had folded the note and placed it inside the envelope, alongside the deed, where it would be found by whoever found the deed, which he had understood would be me. He had known 3 years before his death that this day might come. He had known that Petra would eventually arrive with a folder and a plan. He had known that Boyd would look at the ceiling. He had known that the lot alone would become a conversation at some point. And he had made sure that conversation would have a predetermined ending. And the ending was written in dark blue ink on a sheet of cream stationery. And it said, "This is for the one who stayed. I had stayed not strategically, not with an eye toward what staying would eventually produce. I had stayed because it was right, and because the situation required it, and because there was no version of the story in which I was elsewhere. But my father had understood what the staying meant, and he had named it in 2 sentences before it became something anyone was arguing about. My attorney submitted the sworn statement, the deed, the filing receipt, and the note. Stuart Wark at the Washoe County Recorder's Office confirmed the filing when my attorney requested the record. Stuart is a careful, procedural man, not dramatic, not given to emphasis. He confirmed that the recording had been submitted in proper form, that the document had met all requirements under Nevada statute, and that the recording had proceeded in the ordinary course on the date stamped on the face of the document. His records are meticulous. They have always been meticulous. The estate attorney had a handwriting analysis done on the note. This was, I gathered, a necessary precaution on her part. The analysis compared the note against 36 years of documented writing samples from my father, birthday cards, tax correspondence, the household accounts, the labels on the fireproof box in the closet. The comparison was not a close call. The note was in my father's handwriting. The signature matched his documented signature across every available sample. There was no ambiguity. The objection was withdrawn in 19 days. 19 days from submission to withdrawal. I marked the date. Not because I was celebrating. There was nothing celebratory about it. But because I am the kind of person who marks dates, who keeps the record accurate, who knows that the document is only as useful as its timestamp. My attorney called me at my desk at the permit review office on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a water use application for a mineral extraction operation in Humboldt County, an application that had submitted its aquifer impact assessment 6 days past the filing deadline, and was going to require a letter of deficiency before I could proceed with the review. She said, "The objection has been withdrawn." I thanked her. I wrote the deficiency letter. I went home. What happened in those 19 days between the submission and the withdrawal is not mysterious, though I was not present for most of it. I know what the documentation produced. Odette's statement was specific and firsthand and 40-year detailed, given by a woman who does not embellish and who had been asked by my father himself to remember exactly what she had seen. The handwriting analysis had resolved quickly and without ambiguity. The recording confirmation had come from the county itself, from Stuart Wark's impeccable files. The statute was not ambiguous. A properly recorded gift deed in Nevada is irrevocable. There is no direction in which a challenge to this particular deed could travel that does not run into a wall of documentation and public record. The estate attorney, Petra's attorney that is, had tried the capacity argument. It was the only argument available. And the capacity argument had dissolved on contact with the actual facts of April 9th, 3 years before my father's death. A 66-year-old man, 18 months past a cardiac episode, fully alert and functional, who had initiated and managed his own appointment with a property attorney, who had reviewed the draft deed in advance, who had arrived at the signing prepared, who had signed with full awareness of what he was signing, and who had written a 2-sentence note afterward in his own hand explaining exactly why he had done it. There is no cognitive impairment argument that survives those facts. There was no undue influence argument that survived Odette's statement. There was nothing left. I had my first conversation with Petra after the withdrawal on a phone call she initiated, 3 weeks after the objection was dropped. I had expected the call eventually. She is not the kind of person who allows a situation to remain unresolved without at least one direct conversation. The call lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I know because I looked at the screen after it ended. She asked, without preamble, whether I would consider a buyout. She named a figure close to the Zillow number, adjusted slightly downward for what she characterized as the complications of the situation. She named it cleanly, without embellishment. Efficiency has always been Petra's natural mode, even when the efficiency serves a purpose I disagree with. I said no. There was a pause. She said, "Dad loved you more." She said it in a flat, honest tone, the tone of a person speaking a true thing that costs them something, without disguising the cost. It was, I think, the most direct thing she had said to me in years. I said, "I know." The call ended. I want to tell you what I knew about my father's love, because it matters to the story and because I think it is different from what Petra meant when she said it. My father did not love me more because I stayed. He loved me in a particular way, a specific way, the way you love someone who is built like you, who thinks like you, who approaches the world with the same habits of attention that you have spent your life developing. He loved Petra in a different way. He worried about her, I think, in a way he did not worry about me. Because Petra is decisive and fast-moving and occasionally certain of things that turn out to require more examination than she gave them. He had seen this pattern across 50 years of watching her operate in the world. He had seen what it could produce. He had not given me the deed because he loved me more. He had given me the deed because the deed was accurate, because I had been the one who stayed, and the staying was real, and the staying deserved to be recorded somewhere other than inside his own understanding. He had put it on paper with the notary's seal and a county filing stamp and 2 sentences in dark blue ink, because that is the language in which real things persist. This is the thing I most want you to understand. If you are listening to this story and thinking about your own family, your own house, your own complicated love, documents are not weapons. They are not instruments of cruelty or punishment. They are simply the record of what is true. My father made the deed because the truth of who had cared for this house and who had cared for him needed to exist somewhere more durable than memory, somewhere that could survive argument and distance and the particular amnesia that grief produces in people who were not present. He trusted the record to do the work. He trusted me to find the record. And he trusted Odette Ferreira to remember what she had witnessed. After the withdrawal of the objection, I turned my attention to the practical matters that needed attending to. I had the water rights formally updated in my name as sole owner, a form, a filing fee, a Wednesday morning at the county offices completed before noon. I had a title company prepare the updated owner of record documentation so that every official record in the county system reflected the current state of ownership clearly and without ambiguity. I had the deed itself and my father's note placed in professional archival storage at a firm in Reno that manages documents for several law offices and for the county recorder's office itself. Everything properly sleeved, properly labeled, properly preserved. I also spent 3 days going through the rest of my father's papers, not the fireproof box, which I had already organized, but the secondary files, the folders in the desk drawer, the envelopes in the nightstand, the cardboard box in the back of the hall closet behind the fireproof box. My father had been a thorough record keeper, and his thoroughness extended to the secondary materials as well. There were insurance policies, old tax returns, receipts for major repairs going back to the early 90s. There was a folder labeled House History that contained the original 1978 deed, the survey conducted at purchase, and every subsequent appraisal the house had ever received. There were Christmas cards from people I didn't recognize, and some I did. And there was a second envelope addressed to Petra in my father's handwriting, sealed. I found it on the second day of going through the desk. It was at the back of the middle drawer, behind a rubber-banded stack of utility receipts. My father's block letters on the front, Petra. No date on the envelope, no return address, just the name. I held it for a moment. I thought about whether to open it. I thought about Petra's voice on the phone. Dad loved you more. And the particular honesty of that statement, the cost of it. I thought about my father writing 2 envelopes, one for each of us, both left in different places, both waiting for a future that had now arrived. I did not open it. I put it in the mail to Phoenix. I did not include a note. There was nothing I needed to say. Whatever was in the envelope was what my father had wanted to say to Petra, in his own words, and it was not mine to annotate or interpret or preface. I put a stamp on it and put it in the mailbox on my way to work the next morning. I do not know if she has opened it. I have not asked. There are things in families that should be allowed to settle on their own. After the legal matter was closed, Odette and I had a long coffee at the kitchen table. Not a formal visit, she came over on a Thursday afternoon, the way she had been coming over on Thursday afternoons for 30 years. Without announcement, without occasion, just because Thursday was a day she sometimes came. We sat at the table, and she had coffee from my mother's ceramic mug, and I had tea. And we talked about my father, and about the way the neighborhood had changed, and about the cottonwood tree at the back fence that had been growing steadily for as long as either of us could remember, and that now provided significant shade across the yard every afternoon, from about 2 o'clock onward. She said, "He was very clear that morning. I think about it sometimes. He was clearer than I'd seen him in years. Not the clarity of someone who was afraid, the clarity of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out." She set down the mug. "He asked me afterward if I thought he was doing the right thing. I said yes. He said, 'I know it's the right thing. I just wanted to hear someone else say it.'" I thought about that for a long time after she left. I thought about my father sitting at this table 36 months before his death, asking Odette if he was doing the right thing. Not because he doubted it, because some decisions, even the clear ones, are better carried with a witness. That is the same reason he asked her to sign the deed. That is the same reason she said yes. Pip Harker a man I know from the permit office who has handled several complex water rights cases in the northern part of the basin, asked me once during a lunch break what the hardest part of my job was. I told him it was the gap between what is true and what is documented and the work of closing that gap. He said he thought that was a strange way to describe it. I said, if the true thing isn't documented, it doesn't survive. He thought about that and said, that's true of a lot of things, isn't it? I said, yes. My father understood this. He understood it the way a man understands something he has practiced his entire life without naming it, as a reflex, as a habit, as the natural shape of how careful people move through the world. He kept his papers. He filed his documents. He understood that the fireproof box existed not because he was afraid of fire, but because important things deserve protection, and that protection begins with knowing what you have and where you put it. I am the same way. I have been the same way since I was old enough to understand what a filing date meant. And when Petra slid that folder across the table, the draft partition action, the Zillow printout, the 60-day timeline, I went to the closet and brought back the one document that my father had filed in the right place, on the right day with the right stamp and the right witnesses. And that was the end of it. The withdrawals and the phone calls and the 4 minutes and 20 seconds and the "Dad loved you more," all of that was aftermath. The story itself ended the moment I placed the deed on the table. Everything after that was just the record catching up to what was already true. 3 weeks after the objection was withdrawn, Petra called from Phoenix. I was at the kitchen counter when the phone rang. Late afternoon, the light through the west window was in its amber register. The ceramic mug was on the counter, where it always is, where it has been for 11 months and longer. She did not begin with pleasantries. She said, calmly and without preamble, that she wanted to ask whether I had given any thought to a buyout arrangement. She named a figure, not exactly the Zillow number, adjusted downward for what she described as carrying costs and the whole situation. She named it the way she names all figures, efficiently without sentimentality, as if the cleanliness of the number were itself a form of respect. I said no. There was a pause, a specific pause, not the pause of someone thinking, but the pause of someone who had expected one answer and received another and was recalibrating. Then she said, "Dad loved you more." She said it flatly, without anger and without tears, in the particular tone of a person speaking a true thing they resent having to acknowledge, speaking it not to wound, but because there is no other honest way to say it. It was the most unguarded thing she had said to me in years. It was almost generous in its honesty. I said, I know. I said it simply, without elaboration, because it was true, and because the truth of it did not need to be explained. My father had loved both of us in the specific ways that a father loves children who are different from each other. He had worried about Petra in the way you worry about people who move through the world too confidently. And he had been proud of me in the way you are proud of someone who reminds you of yourself and has managed to become more than you were. He had given me the deed not because he loved Petra less, but because the deed was accurate, because what it said was true, because the one who stays deserves to have the staying acknowledged somewhere more durable than feeling. Petra said, "I just wanted you to know I think that's not fair." I thought about that. I thought about fairness and what it means in a family in a house that someone bought for $62,000 in 1978 and lived in and maintained and passed down not through a will, but through a recorded gift deed on a spring morning 3 years before the end. I thought about the moving truck, already half full. I thought about Boyd's gesture at the reception. I thought about the 4 numbered questions and no condolences. I said, "I understand." The call ended. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I stood in the kitchen for a while. The light came through the window in its long amber bars. The house was quiet in its particular way, the way it has always been quiet, not empty but settled. The way a place feels when it has been inhabited carefully for a long time and knows exactly what it is. I thought about my father's 2 sentences. "This is for the one who stayed." He had written that in April, 3 years before he died. He had folded the note and placed it in the envelope beside the deed. He had put the envelope on the shelf. He had not mentioned it again. He had simply trusted the record to do the work when the work was needed. The deed was still on the kitchen table, where I had placed it the day Petra and Boyd came. I had not moved it. I had left it there for 3 weeks, on the table where it had been signed. In the kitchen it had been signed to protect. I picked it up now and looked at it one more time. The notary seal, the county recording stamp, the date, Odette's signature, my name, Nora Patricia Callum, Sol Doni. I placed it in the archival sleeve and carried it to the box. It was done. I filed the note, my father's 2-sentence note on cream stationery, in the same archival sleeve as the recorded deed, in its own separate sleeve, with a label noting the date it was written and the date it was produced. I had everything stored properly at the archival firm in Reno, where it will be as close to permanent as paper can be. I had the water rights updated in my name as sole owner of record. A Wednesday morning, a form, a modest fee, completed before noon. I had the title updated to reflect sole ownership clearly and without ambiguity across every relevant county record. I arranged this with the same title company my father had used 3 years earlier. They had the original filing in their system, and the update required only the standard documentation. Then I repainted the front door. My mother had always wanted the door painted a deep slate blue. She had mentioned it across the years, had brought home paint chips twice, had held the chips against the existing warm brown wood in different lights at different times of day. She had never quite gotten around to choosing. Then she was gone, and my father had left the door as it was, because he was a man who did not change things without a reason, and the door was not a reason. And then I had left it that way through all the years of maintenance, through the roof and the water heater, and 4 years of caregiving, and the decision to repaint the kitchen ceiling, but not the door. I chose a Saturday in May. I went to the paint counter and spent 20 minutes comparing 2 slightly different blues, the one she had held up more often, and the darker one she had sometimes set aside. And I left with the darker one, which I had always believed was right even when I could not have said exactly why. It took 2 coats, applied Saturday morning and Sunday morning, in the dry Nevada air that cured the paint faster than the label suggested. By Sunday evening, the door was the color it had always needed to be. Odette came for coffee on a Thursday, the way she has come for coffee on Thursdays for 30 years. She walked up the front path and stopped at the porch steps and looked at the door without speaking for a long moment. Then she said, "That's exactly the color she always meant to use. Not approximately. Exactly." As though my mother's intention had been sitting in the air around the house for 20 years, waiting for someone to make it physical. We sat at the kitchen table and had coffee and talked about my father and about the cottonwood at the back fence and about the neighbor 2 houses down who had finally gotten a dog. Odette held my mother's ceramic mug with both hands, as she always has, the small blue flower and the word flower in the looping librarian's script facing outward. Boyd listed a commercial property in Phoenix 6 weeks later. Odette heard it through her Phoenix family. It was not this property. It was not this house. It was not this kitchen. I received one more piece of mail related to the whole situation. A brief formal letter from Petra's attorney confirming that the matter was closed and that no further claims were being pursued. I filed it in the appropriate section of the document box. Everything has its place. Some inheritances are not handed down at a will reading with an attorney in a conference room and a box of tissues on the table. They are handed over quietly at a kitchen table years before anyone has begun to do the math, by someone who understood that love and legal clarity are not opposites, that the most loving thing you can do for the person who will stay is to make sure the record says so before anyone arrives to dispute it. My father understood this. He made the document. He filed it with the county. He placed it in an envelope with a note in dark blue ink and put my name on the outside in his deliberate block letters, on the assumption that the right person would know where to look. The right person always knew where to look. What he left me was not just a house. It was a lesson in the language that outlasts intention, the language of documents, of recording stamps, of notary seals, and county filing numbers, and a witness who remembers dates precisely. He taught me this language for decades before I ever needed to use it. And then, 3 years before his death, he used it for me. If you have ever sat across a table from someone who had already counted something that belonged to you, tell me in the comments. Tell me where you were listening from and what you held and whether the room went as quiet as my kitchen went on that Tuesday morning when the moving truck was still in the driveway. I want to know how far these stories travel. Thank you for being here. Stay with Lena. We have more of these.